Welcome to Dark Night. I'm here with you tonight, ready to guide you through the shadows and into peaceful sleep. I know many of you come here to drift away from the world, to let these tales carry you into slumber. Before we begin our journey together, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Dark Night for more whispered stories in the darkness. Tonight, 3 eerie tales await you. Stories that will unfold against the gentle sound of rain and the comfort of a black screen. No bright lights to disturb your rest, just my voice and the mysteries I'll share. So settle in now. Pull your blankets close. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the rain outside wash away the day's worries. The darkness is welcoming tonight, and I'll be here with you until dawn breaks. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind wander, and prepare to slip into the unknown. Story 1. The Night Shift Visitor. This story comes from a security guard who worked the graveyard shift at an old office building, a place where silence had weight and shadows seemed to breathe. My name is Marcus, and for 3 years I worked nights at the Meridian Corporate Center, a 20-story glass tower built in the 70s that housed various businesses during the day. By night it became my domain, empty, echoing and strangely alive in ways I never expected. The building had that particular smell old office buildings get, a mixture of carpet cleaner, stale coffee, and something else. Something I could never quite identify. It was metallic, almost organic, like pennies left in a pocket too long. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, creating a white noise that should have been comforting but somehow made every other sound more pronounced. My routine was simple enough. Clock in at 11 p.m., make rounds every 2 hours, monitor the security cameras, and try to stay awake until 7 a.m. when the day shift arrives. The pay was decent, and I thought I'd found the perfect job for someone who preferred solitude and quiet. The first few months passed without incident. I'd walk the empty halls, my footsteps echoing off the polished floors, checking locked doors and ensuring all was secure. The building felt peaceful then, just a sleeping giant waiting for Monday morning to bring it back to life. It was during my 4th month that I first noticed her. Was reviewing the security footage from the previous week when I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the camera monitoring the 15th floor, there was a woman. She appeared for just 3 frames, standing in the hallway near the elevator bank, perfectly still, wearing what looked like a dark business suit. Her face was turned away from the camera, and her long black hair hung straight down her back. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. on a Wednesday. I remembered that night clearly. I had made my rounds as usual, walking that exact hallway around 3:15 a.m. There had been no one there. No one at all. I rewound the footage several times, studying each frame. She appeared suddenly in frame 47-302, stood motionless for exactly 3 frames, then vanished. Not walked away, not moved to another part of the hallway. Simply vanished as if she had never been there at all. I told myself it was a glitch in the system. Old security cameras were notorious for artifacts and false images. Digital noise could create all sorts of phantom shapes, especially in low light conditions. I filed a maintenance request and tried to forget about it, but 2 weeks later she appeared again. This time I was watching the live feed when it happened. I was monitoring the 12th floor camera, sipping my coffee and fighting the drowsiness that always hit around 3 a.m. when she stepped into view. Not walking, stepped, as if she had materialized from the wall itself. My coffee cup slipped from my hands, crashing to the floor and shattering. The hot liquid splashed across my shoes, but I barely noticed. I was transfixed by what I was seeing on the monitor. She stood in the center of the hallway, facing away from the camera. Her posture was perfect. Shoulders straight, arms at her sides, feet together. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Just stood there like a statue carved from shadow. I grabbed the radio with trembling hands and called my supervisor, Jim, who worked the day shift and often stayed late to catch up on paperwork. Jim, are you still in the building? I've got someone on 12 who shouldn't be here. The radio crackled. Negative, Marcus. The building's been empty since 6. Everyone's gone home. You sure about what you're seeing? I looked back at the monitor. She was gone. She was just here. Camera 12, center of the hallway. Dark suit, long black hair. Run a sweep of that floor. Check all the doors. Look for signs of forced entry. But Marcus, you know as well as I do that all the elevators are locked down after hours. Keycard access only. No one gets up there without triggering the system. He was right. The building's security was thorough. Every entrance was monitored. Every elevator required keycard access after business hours, and all the stairwell doors were equipped with alarms. There was no way someone could reach the upper floors without me knowing. I took the elevator to the 12th floor, my heart pounding as the numbers climbed. The doors opened with their usual mechanical wheeze, and I stepped into the hallway where she had been standing. The carpet showed no footprints. The air held no trace of perfume or any human scent. It was as if she had never been there at all, except for one thing, the temperature. The spot where she had been standing was at least 10 degrees colder than the rest of the hallway. I could feel it through my uniform shirt, a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I held my hand over the area and felt the cold rise up like invisible fog. I spent the next hour checking every door, every office, every supply closet on that floor. Everything was locked tight. No signs of entry, no disturbed dust, no evidence that anyone had been there. But the cold spot remained until nearly dawn. Over the following months, she appeared more frequently. Always between 3 hours and 3:30 a.m., always on different floors, always facing away from the cameras. I began to notice patterns in her appearances. She seemed to favor floors that had recently experienced high turnover. Floors where employees had quit suddenly or businesses had relocated without warning. I started keeping a log, documenting each sighting. The entries grew longer as I tried to capture every detail. October 15th, 3:22 a.m., floor 8, near the west stairwell. Duration 4 frames. Temperature drop noted. Subject appears to be wearing the same dark suit. Hair longer than previous sightings. October 23rd, 3:07 a.m., floor 16, elevator bank. Duration 2 frames. Distinct cold spot lasting 2 hours. Motion sensor in adjacent hallway triggered repeatedly with no visible cause. November 3rd, 3:19 a.m., floor 5, outside suite 503. Duration 6 frames, longest yet. Subject appears to have turned slightly toward camera, but face remains obscured. Cold spot accompanied by electrical interference. Lights flickered for 20 minutes. I researched the building's history, spending my free time at the public library and digging through old newspaper archives. The Meridian Corporate Center had been built on the site of an older office building that had burned down in 1969. 7 people had died in that fire, trapped on the upper floors when the stairwells filled with smoke. One of the victims was a young woman named Catherine Marsh. She had worked as a secretary for a law firm on the 15th floor, the same floor where I had first seen the figure in the security footage. The newspaper photo showed a woman with long dark hair, professional appearance, probably in her mid-20s. The description matched. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Plenty of women had long dark hair and wore business suits. The building employed hundreds of people during its operational years. It could be anyone, or no one at all. But the sightings continued and they began to change. She started appearing in the same locations repeatedly, as if establishing a routine of her own. The 15th floor became her favorite haunt, particularly the hallway outside what had been Suite 1507. The same suite number where Catherine Marsh had worked in the original building. More disturbing were the changes in the building itself during her appearances. Lights would flicker throughout multiple floors. The elevator system would malfunction, stopping at floors where no one had pressed the call button. The air conditioning would kick on at full blast, dropping the temperature throughout the building. And then there were the sounds. It started with footsteps, the sharp click of heels on polished floor, always just out of range of the security cameras. I would hear them echoing through the empty halls during my rounds, but when I followed the sound, I found nothing. The footsteps had no source, no owner. Just the steady click, click, click of someone walking with purpose through a building that should have been empty. Sometimes I heard typing. The rapid clatter of fingers on keyboard keys coming from offices I knew were vacant. When I investigated, the rooms were dark and silent, but the keys on the abandoned keyboards would still be warm to the touch. The worst was the phone calls. They started around my 6th month on the job. The main desk phone would ring at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night she appeared. When I answered, there was only silence, but it wasn't empty silence. It was the kind of silence that feels crowded, as if someone was holding their breath on the other end of the line. Hello? I would say into the receiver. Hello, is anyone there? Nothing. Just that weighted silence that seemed to press against my ear like a living thing. Then one night, she answered. I can't find my way out. The voice was soft, distant, like someone speaking through layers of cotton. There was no emotion in it, no urgency. Just a simple statement of fact. Who is this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The stairs are filled with smoke. I can't see. I can't find my way out. The line went dead. I sat staring at the phone for nearly an hour, replaying those words in my mind. The stairs are filled with smoke. It was exactly what the fire victims would have experienced in 1969, trapped on upper floors while smoke poured through the stairwells, cutting off their escape routes. The next night she appeared on camera again, but this time was different. Instead of standing motionless, she was walking, slowly, deliberately, down the 15th floor hallway. She moved with the careful steps of someone feeling their way through darkness, one hand extended as if trailing along a wall. When she reached the end of the hallway, she stopped at the emergency exit door. The camera angle showed her in profile for the first time, and what I saw made my blood freeze. Her face was exactly what I had expected, and exactly what I had feared. Young, professional, with the same bone structure as Catherine Marsh from the newspaper photo, but her eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too bright, reflecting light like mirrors in the dim hallway. She stood at that door for a long moment, then turned to look directly into the camera. I felt her gaze like a physical weight, pressing against me through the electronic connection between camera and monitor. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Help me find the way. Then she placed her hand on the emergency exit door handle and turned it. The alarm should have screamed. That door was connected to the building's security system, rigged to sound alerts throughout the entire complex if opened after hours, but the alarm never sounded. Instead, the door simply opened, revealing not the stairwell beyond, but absolute darkness. Not shadow, not the absence of light, but darkness with substance. Darkness that seemed to move and breathe. She stepped through that impossible doorway and vanished. The door swung shut behind her and the hallway returned to normal fluorescent-lit emptiness. I quit the next morning. When I turned in my resignation, Jim looked at me with knowing eyes. The night shift visitor? He asked quietly. I stared at him. You know about her. Marcus, you're the 7th guard to quit this job in the past 5 years. They all reported the same thing. Woman in a dark suit, always between 3 and 3:30 a.m., always looking for a way out. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. The company doesn't like to talk about it. Bad for business, you know? But we've learned to expect a certain turnover in the night security position. Why didn't you warn me? Would you have believed me if I had? He was right, of course. I wouldn't have believed it until I experienced it myself. What happened to the other guards? I asked. Most of them found other jobs. But there was one. Johnson, his name was. He worked here about 2 years ago. Real determined guy, didn't want to let some ghost story run him off. Jim's expression grew troubled. He decided to try to help her. Started staying after his shift, following her appearances, trying to communicate with her. What happened to him? They found him in the stairwell between the 15th and 16th floors. Heart attack according to the coroner. But Marcus... Jim leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. When they found him, his eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling. And his face had this expression of absolute terror, like he'd seen something no human should ever see. I left the Meridian Corporate Center that day and never looked back. I found work at a small office complex across town. Day shift only, well lit, filled with the comfortable noise of human activity. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in the early hours of the morning, I think about Catherine Marsh. I wonder if she's still there, still walking those empty hallways, still searching for a way out of a burning building that exists only in her memory. And sometimes, when the house is very quiet and the shadows in my bedroom seem deeper than they should be, I hear the sound of heels clicking on the polished floor. Getting closer and closer, I tell myself it's just my imagination. After all, I'm miles away from the Meridian Corporate Center now. There's no reason for her to follow me home, but last night my phone rang at exactly 3:17 a.m. I didn't answer it. If you're listening now, where are you from? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's sharing this darkness with me tonight. Now, let's slip into our next tale story. 2. The House with No Mirrors. This story was shared with me by a woman named Sarah, who learned that some houses carry the weight of their previous owner's obsessions, and some reflections are better left unseen. I should have known something was wrong with the house the moment I walked through the front door. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like stepping into a room where an argument had just ended. The air felt heavy, expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The realtor, Mrs. Chen, was overly cheerful in that way people get when they're trying too hard to sell something. She practically bounced through the rooms, pointing out hardwood floors, original crown molding, and the beautiful bay windows that let in so much natural light. And the price, she said, her smile stretched a little too wide, is really quite reasonable for this neighborhood. The previous owner was very motivated to sell. I should have asked more questions about that previous owner. I should have wondered why someone would be motivated to sell such a beautiful Victorian house at nearly 30% below market value. But I was 26, fresh out of graduate school, and desperate to find a place I could afford in my new city. The house was perfect for my needs. 3 bedrooms, hardwood throughout, a renovated kitchen, and enough space for the home office I needed for my freelance writing career. The fact that it was within my budget seemed like a miracle. I'll take it, I told Mrs. Chen before we'd even finished the tour. Her smile faltered for just a moment. Don't you want to see the basement? I'll think it over for a few days. No, this is perfect. When can we start the paperwork? Looking back, I realized that Mrs. Chen's relief was tinged with something else. Something that looked almost like guilt. I moved in 3 weeks later, on a gray October afternoon when the leaves were just beginning to turn. The house felt different when it was empty of furniture. Larger somehow, but also more intimate. Every footstep echoed, every door creak seemed amplified. It took me 2 full days of unpacking to notice the first strange thing about my new home. There were no mirrors. Not a single one. No medicine cabinet mirror in the bathroom. No decorative mirrors in the hallways. No mirror above the vanity in the master bedroom. I had assumed the previous owner had simply taken them all, but when I looked more closely, I found something odd. There were clean spots on the walls. Perfect rectangles and ovals where mirrors had obviously hung for years. But around each clean spot, the paint was darker, as if it had been stained or discolored by something, and in several places, I found small holes in the walls where it looked like mirrors had been hastily removed. The mounting hardware pulled out with enough force to damage the drywall. I made a mental note to buy mirrors when I went shopping for household necessities. A house felt incomplete without them. The second strange thing I noticed was the windows. Every single window in the house had been treated with some kind of film. Not tinting exactly, but a coating that made them slightly reflective from the inside. During the day, when sunlight hit them at the right angle, They acted almost like mirrors, showing distorted reflections of the rooms behind me. At first, I thought it was a privacy feature or maybe something to help with energy efficiency, but the film was old, bubbling at the edges and created an unsettling effect. When I caught glimpses of my reflection in the treated windows, it looked wrong somehow, stretched in some places, compressed in others, like looking at yourself in a funhouse mirror. I decided to remove the window film along with buying new mirrors. My first night in the house was restless. The building settled and creaked in ways I wasn't used to, and every sound seemed amplified in the empty rooms I hadn't yet furnished. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by what sounded like glass breaking somewhere in the house. I grabbed a flashlight and searched every room, checking for broken windows or fallen picture frames. I found nothing. No glass, no signs of damage, nothing out of place. But the sound had been so clear, so sharp, that I was certain something had shattered. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or maybe something falling in the neighbor's yard. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store to buy mirrors and supplies to remove the window film. The clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, helped me select appropriate mirrors for each room. "Nice old house you must have," he said as he rang up my purchases. "These Victorian places have such character." "Yes, it's beautiful. I just moved in yesterday, 1247 Elm Street." His hand stopped moving across the register keys. He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The Morrison place? I don't know." The realtor didn't mention the previous owner's name. He finished the transaction in silence, but I caught him glancing at me several times with what looked like concern. As I loaded my purchases into my car, he appeared at my elbow. "Miss," he said quietly, "I don't mean to pry, but be careful with those mirrors. That house, well, maybe it's better the way it is." "What do you mean?" He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Probably nothing. Old stories, you know. But if you have any problems at all, you bring those mirrors back here. No questions asked. Full refund." I drove home with his words echoing in my mind. What kind of problems could mirrors cause? That afternoon, I started with the bathroom mirror above the sink. It was a simple installation, just mounting brackets and careful measuring. As I positioned the mirror and tightened the screws, I felt oddly nervous, though I couldn't say why. When I stepped back to admire my work, my reflection looked back at me from the newly hung mirror. Everything seemed normal. My face, my clothes, the bathroom behind me. But there was something in my expression that I didn't remember putting there. A tension around my eyes, a tightness to my mouth, as if my reflection was worried about something I wasn't. I shook my head and chalked it up to the stress of moving and lack of sleep. Next, I hung a large decorative mirror in the living room, positioning it to reflect the beautiful bay windows and make the room feel larger. Again, the installation went smoothly, but when I stepped back to check the placement, I felt that same inexplicable unease. The mirror showed the room exactly as it should. Furniture, windows, hardwood floors, but somehow the reflected room felt different from the real one, colder maybe, or more shadowed despite the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. I decided to save the remaining mirrors for another day and started working on removing the window film. Instead, the film peeled away easily enough, but underneath it I found something that made my stomach clench with sudden dread. Scratches. Deep, deliberate scratches scored into the glass of every window, forming letters and words that had been hidden beneath the film. Most of the messages were illegible, overlapping and carved with what must have been frantic desperation, but some phrases were clear enough to read. "Don't look, she's always watching mirrors, leech it out while you still can." These scratches weren't random vandalism. They had been carved from the inside of the house by someone who had lived here, someone who had been trying to send a warning to future residents, or maybe just trying to remind themselves of some terrible truth. I spent that evening researching the house's history online. Property records showed that it had been owned by the Morrison family for nearly 40 years. James and Margaret Morrison had purchased it as newlyweds in 1983. Margaret had died in 2019, and James had moved to assisted living shortly after, putting the house on the market. 40 years was a long time to live in one place, long enough to scratch desperate warnings into windows and remove every mirror in the house. That night I was awakened again by the sound of breaking glass. This time I knew exactly where it was coming from. The bathroom, where I had hung the new mirror that afternoon. I found the mirror intact, still hanging securely on its mounting brackets. But the surface was wrong. Instead of showing my reflection, it seemed to ripple like water, the silver backing moving in slow waves that made no sense. As I watched, my reflection appeared, but it was delayed, like an echo of movement happening a split second after I made it. I reached out to touch the glass, and my reflection did the same. But our fingertips didn't meet at the surface of the mirror. My reflection's finger pressed against the glass from the inside while mine pressed from the outside, and for just a moment, I felt something push back. Something warm and desperate on the other side of the silver. I yanked my hand away and backed out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. The next morning, the mirror appeared normal again. My reflection looked back at me with perfect synchronization. No rippling, no delay. But I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was a handprint on the mirror's surface, pressed against the glass from the inside, as if someone trapped within the reflection was trying to push their way out. I spent the day researching mirror folklore and urban legends, trying to find some rational explanation for what I was experiencing. I learned about scrying mirrors used for divination, about the superstition that mirrors could trap souls, about the old belief that mirrors were doorways to other dimensions. But nothing I read explained the handprint that appeared fresh on the mirror's surface each morning. No matter how many times I cleaned it away, I decided to call Mrs. Chen, the realtor, to ask about the Morrison family. "Oh, they were lovely people," she said, but her voice sounded strained. "Very private, though. Kept to themselves, mostly. The house didn't have any mirrors when I moved in. Do you know why?" Well, I assumed they just took them when they moved. People take mirrors, you know. "Mrs. Chen, there are scratch marks on all the windows. Messages about mirrors and watching. What happened in that house?" "Sarah, I think you should know." Margaret Morrison spent her final years in psychiatric care. After her husband moved her to the facility, he told me she had developed an obsession with mirrors. Said she claimed there was someone living in them, watching her, trying to get out. He removed all the mirrors from the house for her peace of mind. What kind of someone? A woman. Margaret insisted there was a woman trapped in the mirrors and that she was angry, desperately angry about being trapped. The doctor said it was a form of dementia, but James wasn't so sure. He said Margaret had always been the most rational person he knew. That evening, I stood in my living room, staring at the large, decorative mirror I had hung the day before. My reflection stared back, but I found myself studying it for inconsistencies, for any sign that it wasn't quite right. As I watched, something moved behind my reflection, just for a moment, like a shadow passing quickly across the background of the mirror. But when I turned to look at the real room behind me, nothing was there. I turned back to the mirror, and my reflection was smiling. I was not smiling. My reflection's smile was wide, almost predatory, and her eyes held an intelligence that felt separate from my own. She raised her hand in a small wave, and I felt my own hand begin to rise involuntarily, as if she was controlling it. I jerked my hand down and backed away from the mirror, but my reflection stayed where she was, still smiling, still waving. Now I could see her clearly. She looked exactly like me, but there was something wrong with her proportions. She was too tall, her limbs too long, her fingers extending just a little further than they should. And behind her, in the reflected room that should have matched my living room perfectly, there were other figures. Shadowy forms moving slowly through spaces that didn't quite align with the real room. I could see them more clearly in my peripheral vision. Women in outdated clothing, all of them watching me with the same hungry intensity as my distorted reflection. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, but I could still feel them watching from beneath the fabric. The covered mirror seemed to pulse with contained energy, like something alive trying to break free. That night I heard voices coming from every reflective surface in the house. The bathroom mirror, the kitchen windows, even the black screen of my television. All of them whispered with urgent, overlapping voices. "Let us out. We've been waiting so long. Margaret tried to help us, but she was too weak. You're stronger. You can break the glass. We just want to be free." I spent the night in my car, parked in the driveway, watching the house through the windshield. Every window glowed with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to come from within the glass itself. And in each window I could see figures, dozens of them, all pressing their hands against the glass from the inside, all looking out at me with expressions of desperate hope. In the morning I called the hardware store clerk who had sold me the mirrors. "I need to return them," I said. "All of them. And I need to know what you know about that house." He met me at the store before opening hours, and we loaded the mirrors into his truck in silence. When we were done, he poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos and handed me one. "My grandmother lived on Elm Street," he said quietly, 3 houses down from the Morrison place. She used to tell stories about that house. Said it was built on the site of an old boarding house that burned down in 1892. 7 women died in that fire, trapped on the upper floors. What does that have to do with mirrors? According to my grandmother, the boarding house was run by a woman named Eleanor Blackwood. She was unusual, had mirrors in every room, claimed they were for the safety and comfort of her residents. But the women who lived there started acting strangely. They'd spend hours staring at their reflections, talking to them like they were separate people. Neighbors reported seeing figures in the windows even when the rooms were supposed to be empty. He sipped his coffee and stared out at the street. When the fire started, witnesses said they could see women in the upper floor windows pressing their hands against the glass. But the rescue crews couldn't find anyone up there. The bodies were all found on the first floor like they had never tried to escape through the windows at all. And you think they're trapped somehow on reflective surfaces? I think Eleanor Blackwood was playing with forces she didn't understand. And when she died, those forces didn't die with her. Margaret Morrison figured it out eventually. That's why she had all the mirrors removed. But by then, it was too late. She'd already seen them, already made contact. Once they know you can see them, they don't let go easily. I left the house that day and never went back. I forfeited my deposit, broke my lease, and moved into a furnished apartment across town. But I was careful to choose one with no mirrors, and I made sure all the windows had heavy curtains that I kept drawn at all times. For months, everything was fine. I convinced myself that I had escaped, that whatever haunted the Morrison house was contained there. But reflections are everywhere, even when you try to avoid them. Store windows, puddles of rainwater, the polished surface of a smartphone screen. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. A face that looks like mine but isn't quite right, watching me from the other side of the glass. And lately I've been finding handprints on the mirrors in public restrooms. Handprints that appear when no one else is around, pressed against the glass from the inside as if someone is trying very hard to push their way through. I know they followed me. I know they're still looking for a way out. And I'm starting to think that maybe eventually I'm going to have to let them. 3, The Forest That Remembers, whispered. First, this final tale comes from a park ranger named David, who learned that some places in the wilderness hold memories, and some memories refuse to stay buried. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, working in state and national forests across the Pacific Northwest. I've seen my share of strange things. Unexplained lights, sounds that don't belong, places where the wildlife won't go. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered in the Whispering Pines Nature Reserve during the autumn of my 3rd year there. Whispering Pines was a small reserve, only about 3,000 acres nestled in the Cascade foothills about 2 hours east of Seattle. It was named for the way the wind moved through the old-growth pine trees, creating a sound like distant voices having quiet conversations. The area had been protected land since the 1960s, preserved as one of the last intact sections of ancient forest in the region. My job was simple enough. Maintain the trails, monitor wildlife populations, assist hikers, and keep an eye out for any signs of illegal camping or poaching. It was peaceful work, the kind that let you lose yourself in the rhythm of the forest and find solace in the company of centuries-old trees. The trouble started in early October, when the leaves were beginning their transformation and the air held that crisp promise of winter. I was doing my morning patrol of the North Trail, a 3-mile loop that wound through some of the oldest sections of the forest, when I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. Footprints. But not from any boots or shoes I recognized. They were small, delicate impressions in the soft earth beside the trail, like those of a child wearing thin-soled shoes or slippers. What made them strange wasn't just their size, but their age. The impressions looked fresh, as if they'd been made within the last few hours. But they led away from the trail and deeper into sections of forest where no child should have been walking alone. I followed the prints for about 50 yards, watching them wind between massive tree trunks and overfallen logs with an odd, dancing pattern that didn't match normal human gait. They seemed to skip and hop, sometimes appearing on both sides of obstacles as if the person making them had simply passed through solid wood. The trail of prints ended at the base of an enormous Douglas fir, one of the largest trees in the reserve. The trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, its bark deeply grooved and darkened with age. But what caught my attention wasn't the tree itself. It was what was carved into the bark about 4 feet up from the ground. Letters. Child-sized letters carved deep into the living wood, spelling out a single word. Help. The carving looked old, the edges worn smooth by weather and time, the bark beginning to grow over them in places. But the letters were still clearly readable, and something about them filled me with an inexplicable sense of urgency, as if whoever had carved them was still waiting for that help to arrive. I made a note of the location and continued my patrol, but I found myself glancing back at that tree repeatedly. The words seemed to follow me through the forest, echoing in my mind with the persistence of an unanswered question. That evening, I researched the history of the land that was now Whispering Pines Nature Reserve. What I found made the carved plea for help take on a much darker significance. In 1952, a family named the Hendersons had owned a small cabin on what was now the northern section of the reserve. Robert and Marie Henderson lived there with their 8-year-old daughter, Emily, leading a quiet, isolated life in the forest. Robert worked as a logger, and Marie homeschooled Emily, keeping detailed journals about their life in the wilderness. On October 15, 1952, Emily Henderson disappeared. According to the police reports I found in the county archives, Emily had been playing in the yard behind the family cabin while her mother prepared dinner. Marie had called her in as the sun was setting, but Emily didn't respond. A search of the immediate area found no trace of the little girl. The search expanded over the following days, with volunteers from nearby towns joining Forest Service personnel and tracking dogs. They found evidence that Emily had wandered into the deep forest, small footprints leading away from the cabin, following no clear path through the dense undergrowth. The searchers followed the trail for 3 days, but it seemed to loop back on itself, creating impossible patterns through terrain that would have been difficult even for an experienced adult to navigate. The tracking dogs became confused and agitated, refusing to follow the scent trail and eventually cowering against their handlers as if something in the forest terrified them. Emily Henderson was never found. The case remained open for years, but eventually was classified as a probable death due to exposure. Robert and Marie moved away within a month of their daughter's disappearance, unable to remain in the place where they had lost her. The cabin was demolished when the land was sold to the state in 1965. But according to the old survey maps I found, it had stood within 100 yards of the large Douglas fir, where I'd found the carved plea for help. Over the following weeks, I encountered more signs of Emily's presence in the forest. Small footprints would appear after rain, always leading from the trail into the deeper woods, always ending at that same massive tree. Sometimes I found other carvings in nearby trees, not words, but simple drawings scratched into the bark with what looked like a sharp stone or a stick figure of a little girl, a house with smoke coming from the chimney, 2 larger figures holding the hands of a smaller one between them, and always, somewhere in each grouping of carvings, that single desperate word, help. The drawings weren't crude children's scribbles. Despite their simple nature, they showed remarkable detail and skill. The stick figure girl had carefully rendered features, large eyes, long hair indicated by flowing lines, even tiny fingers and toes. The house was perfectly proportioned, with windows and doors in exactly the right places. But as the weeks passed, the drawings began to change. The little girl figure appeared in more and more of them, but her posture became increasingly distorted. Her stick arms reached upward as if grasping for something out of reach. Her mouth became a small circle as if she were calling out, and her legs began to look less like legs and more like roots, as if she were becoming part of the forest itself. It was during my patrol on November 3rd that I first heard her voice. I was examining a new set of carvings on a cedar tree, about a quarter mile from the Douglas fir, when I heard it. A child's voice, thin and distant, carried on the wind through the pine branches. Help me. I can't find my way home. I stopped breathing, standing perfectly still as the voice seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. It was definitely a little girl, and the words were clear despite the distance and the interference of wind through leaves. Hello, I called out. Where are you? Silence. Just the normal sounds of the forest, birds rustling leaves, the distant whisper of wind through pine needles. I waited for several minutes, but the voice didn't come again. I spent the rest of that day searching the area around the cedar tree, looking for any sign of a lost child, but found nothing except more of those impossible footprints leading in circles through the undergrowth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that thin, desperate voice asking for help, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily Henderson was still out there somewhere, still lost, still trying to find her way home after more than 60 years. The next morning, I returned to the forest with a different purpose. Instead of following my usual patrol route, I decided to systematically explore every area where I had found Emily's signs, hoping to piece together some pattern that might explain what was happening. I started at the Douglas fir with the original help carving and began walking in a careful grid pattern, marking each tree where I found drawings or messages. After several hours of meticulous searching, I began to see the shape of Emily's wanderings. The carvings formed a rough circle, about 2 miles in diameter, with the Douglas fir at the center. But it wasn't a perfect circle. It was more like a spiral, winding inward in slowly tightening loops, and the closer the carvings were to the center, the more desperate and distorted they became. The outermost drawings showed Emily as a normal stick figure, playing and exploring. But as I moved inward through the spiral, her representations became increasingly frantic. Her arms stretched upward in reaching gestures, her mouth opened wider as if screaming, and strange symbols began appearing alongside the familiar images, symbols that looked almost like letters but didn't match any alphabet I recognized. At the innermost ring of the spiral, just 50 feet from the central Douglas fir, I found the most disturbing carving yet. It was Emily, but not as a stick figure. This carving showed remarkable detail. A little girl with long hair and a simple dress, her face turned upward with an expression of absolute terror. But instead of legs, her lower body dissolved into a tangle of tree roots that seemed to burrow deep into the bark of the tree itself. And beneath this image, carved in letters so deep they had never been worn smooth by weather, were 3 words that made my blood run cold. She took me that evening. I sat in my ranger station cabin, staring at the map where I had marked Emily's spiral of carvings, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The pattern was too deliberate to be random, too complex to be the work of a lost and panicking child. It looked more like a ritual or a trap. I was still studying the map when I heard the tapping. It started softly like rain on the cabin roof, but the sky was clear. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. After a few minutes, I realized it was coming from the north wall of the cabin, the wall that faced deeper into the forest. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the wall where the sound originated. Nothing, just weathered wood and the normal shadows cast by surrounding trees. But the tapping continued, now seeming to come from inside the wall itself. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. The tapping had a hollow quality, as if something small was knocking from within the wall cavity. And between the taps I could swear I heard whispering, too faint to make out words, but definitely the sound of a young voice having an urgent, one-sided conversation. The next morning, I found a new carving on the tree directly opposite the north wall of my cabin. It was Emily again, but this time she was pointing, her stick arm extended toward the cabin, her finger aimed directly at the wall where I had heard the tapping. And underneath the pointing figure, in letters that looked fresh as if they'd been carved during the night, was a single word inside I spent that day researching the history of my cabin. Built in 1963 as part of the original ranger station complex, it had been constructed partly using salvaged lumber from structures that had been torn down when the land was converted to a nature reserve, including lumber from the Henderson family cabin. That night, the tapping returned, but this time it was accompanied by scratching sounds, like fingernails dragging across wood. The sounds moved through the wall from room to room, following me as I walked around the cabin. When I stood still, the scratching stopped. When I moved, it resumed, keeping pace with my footsteps. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was mice or settling wood, but the sounds were too purposeful, too responsive to my movements to be anything natural. Around midnight, the whispering began. It was coming from inside the walls, but now I could make out words. Help me. She won't let me go. She keeps me here. In the wood. In the walls. I can't get out. I can't go home. The voice was Emily's. I was certain of it now. Somehow some part of her consciousness had become trapped in the very lumber that had once been her home. And that lumber had been used to build the cabin where I now worked. But there was something else in the walls with her. Between Emily's pleas for help, I heard another voice. Older, deeper, with a quality that made my skin crawl. She's mine now. Has been mine since the day she wandered too far from home. Children who get lost in my forest don't leave. They become part of the trees, part of the earth, part of me. I realized then what had happened to Emily Henderson 60 years ago. She hadn't simply gotten lost and died of exposure. She had encountered something in the forest, something old and hungry that fed on lost children, trapping their spirits in the wood itself. The next morning I began making preparations to leave Whispering Pines. Whatever was in that forest, whatever had taken Emily and was using her to try to lure me deeper into its domain, I wanted no part of it. But as I packed my belongings, I found myself thinking about that desperate plea carved into the Douglas fir. Help. Emily had been waiting 60 years for someone to hear her, someone to understand what had happened to her. How could I abandon her now? That evening, I returned to the central Douglas fir, carrying a camping axe and a determination to end Emily's suffering. If she was trapped in the wood, then maybe destroying the carvings would free her spirit. But when I reached the tree, I found something that stopped me cold. A new carving, fresh enough that sap still wept from the cut bark. It showed two figures now. Emily with her root-like legs, and beside her, a taller figure that was clearly meant to be me. My stick figure arms were reaching toward Emily, but instead of helping her, the carving showed me becoming like her. My legs dissolving into roots, my face turned upward in the same expression of terror. And beneath both figures, in letters so fresh they seemed to gleam in the fading daylight, were 4 words, now we're both trepidate, I backed away from the tree, but I could feel something watching me from the shadows between the surrounding pines. The forest had grown completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even the sound of my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. "Emily," I called out softly. "She can't answer you anymore." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to rise from the earth beneath my feet. "She tried to warn you, but it's too late. You've seen too much, learned too much. You understand what this place really is." I ran. I ran through the darkening forest, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over fallen logs, desperate to reach my truck and get away from whatever presence inhabited those ancient trees. Behind me I could hear pursuit. Not footsteps, but the sound of wood creaking and branches breaking, as if the forest itself was chasing me. I made it to the truck and drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached Seattle. I submitted my resignation the next morning, citing family emergency, and moved to Arizona, where there are no ancient forests, no towering pines, and no shadows deep enough to hide hungry spirits. But Emily followed me. I still hear her voice sometimes, whispering from wooden furniture, tapping messages inside the walls of whatever building I'm in. She's trying to warn me about something, but I can't understand what. And lately I've been noticing changes in my reflection. My face looks drawn, tired, as if something is slowly draining the life from me. My hands shake more than they should, and I've developed an aversion to being around trees or even wooden objects. I think I understand now. Emily isn't trapped in the forest anymore. She's trapped in me. And whatever took her all those years ago is still hungry, still patient, still waiting for the right moment to add another lost soul to its collection. I've been thinking about returning to Whispering Pines. Emily deserves to go home, even if it means I'll be staying there with her. After all, some debts can only be paid in full.